You're listening to In Bad Company. Today we're joined by Dr. Jerry Root, Professor Emeritus at Wheaton College and one of the world's leading voices on C.S. Lewis. For more than 40 years, he's lectured on Lewis's life and work around the globe, written numerous books and articles, and taught generations of students. In our conversation, we'll explore how he first encountered Lewis, the lessons that matter most for today, and why Lewis's writings continue to speak so powerfully in our time. Well, Jerry, let's start off here with just if you could just give us a description of what you do in the world of C.S. Lewis and academia.
Well, I was a professor for many years, and I taught Lewis courses. I've actually taught Lewis courses. I've been studying him for 55 years, and I taught courses for 45. And I've actually lectured on Lewis in 88 universities in 22 different countries across the world. And I've got 8 books on C.S. Lewis that I've done over the years. And I don't know how people glammed onto it. I have no clue how this all transpired, but I just found myself in the stream and moving with the flow of the stream and enjoying it. You know, I'm fascinated by Lewis. I'm fascinated by more than Lewis, but we can get into those things as you ask your questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard you speak probably about 7-10 years ago, something like that. And I think you're just such a gifted speaker. So I appreciate you coming onto the podcast. And it's cool because you're a speaker to me that, like, when you give a lecture, it makes me want to read books. And I think that excites me. I started wanting to dive into the things that are around Lewis, and you just get excited, and then you want to read what inspired Lewis, and then you want to read, what inspired those guys, and
That's
so
key.
yeah,
He opens more than wardrobe doors. And if you read Lewis well, you'll want to read the books behind him. And he is himself a liberal arts education. And when I started reading Lewis, it wasn't long before I was reading Plato and Homer and Aristotle. I started reading Athanasius and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas. I started reading Dante and Milton, Boethius, My Heavens, what a book. And then I started reading, I think I mentioned Milton, Shakespeare, George Herbert, Philip Sidney, Edmund Spencer. I mean, we could go on and on and on. Lewis leads you other places. He wrote one book called English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. It's only one of the 73 books that are out there under his name. English Literature in the 16th Century, excluding drama. It's 700 pages long. To write that book, he read every book written in English in the 16th century. He read every book translated into English. In the original language it was written, French, Latin, Italian, German, and in translation, so that his judgments about the translation would be informed, not just off the top of the head. It took him 18 years to do that book. It was for the Oxford History of English Literature. He called it his Oh Hell volume because it took so long to write it. And you read it and you laugh your head off because he's so clever. His descriptions are so strong. And again, it opens up a million doors. You start reading those books and you go, oh, I've got to go read Michael Drayton's idea. The things he said about Michael Drayton blew me away. I have to read Philip Sidney. I have to read Edmund Spencer, and it's incredible. That's just one book. And while he was writing that book, he also did The Great Divorce and Narnian Chronicles. He did his science fiction, science space trilogy. He did Mere Christianity. He did Screwtape Letters. He was writing these while he was writing this massive tome. So incredible. So anyway, he has a great reach, great stretch, and anybody who reads him seriously should expect that they're likely to be stretched as well.
Yeah, it's incredible to think at how much I love that idea as he opens doors.
Yeah.
I think for me, I think my heart is the Chronicles of Narnia because that's what got me started. But then his Mere Christianity, I feel like was such a needed place in my life where I grew up in a Christian home and a lot of my friends who I had grown up with the church were just kind of like, I'm done with God, I'm done with the church, walking away. And I think Mere Christianity really helped just to be like, what do I believe? Why do I believe it? You know, and just like I remember sitting on my parents' deck. I was like in high school, and I'd read a chapter, and then I would just like put it down and just think on it.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just it's so it's more, you know, and then it makes you, I think, which is the great thing about Lewis is it brings you back to the Bible. It's like, well, that's what we're being pointed to. You know, it's like I never thought about that in that way. You know.
Well, as I've tried to extrapolate and understand his communication style, it seems to me he gets shoulder to shoulder with his audience. Even in Mere Christianity, he says, have you ever been in an argument? And he brings us right in with common experience. And he starts from there and he goes on. So, so he gets shoulder to shoulder with his audience. He defines and describes something. He depicts it imaginatively. And when he moves away, we're fascinated. We still stay there. He hasn't made us dependent upon him. He's made us interested and curious about the thing itself. He also, Mere Christianity, just to give you a fun story. Um, my college roommate and I got together for a week in Half Moon Bay. It's a bay just south of San Francisco. And we were there for a week just to talk, just to visit with each other. Uh, I had a big hand in his coming to faith. And then he had a big hand encouraging me in mine. We grew together as young Christians. And he was into e-bikes. I had no idea what an e-bike was. And we went for rides above the cliffs. And he says, you got to see this one place where the wave breaks on the cliffs below. And we went up there and it was gorgeous, beautiful, breathtaking. And this couple rides up and we're extolling the beauty with them. And then I said, isn't it nice to know who to thank? And the guy got real huffy all of a sudden. He says, I'm an atheist. Real gruff like that. And I said, I'll bet I can prove in 10 minutes you're not. He said, try. So let's use a little C.S. Lewis. He says, negative knowledge is always harder to prove than positive knowledge. And I said that to this guy. I said, define for me what an atheist is. He says, you believe there's no possibility God exists. I said, I don't think you have enough intellectual stretch or credit to make that judgment. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, the Widener Library at Harvard has 19 million volumes under that one roof. Have you read all those books? He says, of course not. I said, then how can you tell me beyond a reasonable doubt there's nothing in any of those books that might count against your judgment just now? And I said, C.S. Lewis said, to say there's no spider in this place where we're standing, you'd have to check every nook and cranny. To say there is a spider, you could see one scurrying across the ground. Arguments for God's existence are more complex than a spider scurrying, but the image still works to show you the difficulty of your universal judgment there is no God. I said, I prefer an honest agnostic to a dishonest atheist. He looks at me kind of disheveled and he goes, you're right, I'm an agnostic. And I said, well, if you got the first one wrong, maybe you're getting that one wrong too. And he laughed and he said, what do you got for me? I said, I'll send you a book. And I sent him Mere Christianity. I didn't give him my email address, but 2 weeks later, I got an email from that guy and he said, I read the book and I'm moving in your direction. Again, Lewis not only opens up more than wardrobe doors so we go to other books, he opens up more than wardrobe doors so he stretches our understanding so we can get our heads into a wider world. And I think it's fabulous. And Mere Christianity is a book that did that. And as he gave those radio broadcasts at the BBC during World War II, people were doubtful about what the outcome was going to be of this war, this most mechanized war in human history. World War I was supposed to have been the war that ended all wars, and here's World War II, and we don't know where this thing's going. And every week he's on the BBC talking to people about matters of faith and being heard. I've met people who actually listened to it during World War II, and they talked about the fact that this really bolstered their courage and also opened their doors to faith. It's amazing. Anyway, there you go.
Yeah, it really is. I always like to joke that Lewis actually did have a podcast. It was those radio broadcasts, you know?
Oh, here's one for you. There's a book that came out called C.S. Lewis at the BBC, and it was written by the historian of the BBC. So the BBC, when it started in the late 1920s, the guy who started it was a Christian. Uh, Heath was his name, I think. And he was looking for a word to talk about their transmissions, what we call our transmissions. He was reading in Matthew 13 in the King James Version in his quiet time that morning, and it says, "The sower went out to sow, and he sowed his seed broadcast." And he goes, there's the word. Broadcast comes from the Bible, the word broadcast. Every time you hear it said, people don't realize that's where it came from. And now you get podcast, which is a play off broadcast. Isn't it interesting?
Yeah, that really is. I never knew that.
Yeah.
Well, so what I would love to hear about what originally brought you to Lewis, or what was your first experience?
Um, I went to college. You have to take it by faith now, but I was an athlete. I played football and wrestled all through college. And I had really no academic um, interest. I was wanting to stay eligible. That was about as academically inclined as I was. Right when I came to college, somebody led me to Christ. And I said, okay, if I'm a Christian, then I should know the Bible. So I read the Bible through that first year and a half. And I've been reading it every year since. I've read it over 65 times, the whole Bible, and probably the New Testament besides that, maybe 53 times. And my Greek Bible, I'm not a Greek scholar, but if I have a lexicon nearby, I can get through it. And I've read it 2.5 times. So my mind woke up when I started reading the Bible, and I'm witnessing to people about Jesus. And I'm hearing my teammates and stuff ask me questions. And when I'd go digging for answers, I'd see the name C.S. Lewis crop up, but I never really read him. I visited my sister. She was teaching fifth grade, and I visited her during spring break one time. We were at her house for dinner, and she was reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to her fifth grade kids, and she told me the plot of that book. I go, come on, there's books like this? I freaked out. I went and bought a set of the Narnian books, and I read them over the next couple of weeks. I said, I want to find out more about this guy. So then I went and I found Surprised by Joy, his story of how he came to faith. It's not quite an autobiography because it only covers that part of his life, but nevertheless, it was the closest thing I could find an autobiography. I read it, and that was the book that hooked me. He talked about being haunted by these deep longings and the desire to quest till he found the object of his deepest longings. I knew the longings. Lewis gave me a vocabulary for my own soul. And it was that book that hooked me, and I just started reading him voraciously. Then I had a college professor. There were only 3 Christian professors at my college that I was aware of. And this guy was one of the most respected. He was a philosophy professor, and I saw he was requiring some C.S. Lewis for his class. I took him. I ended up basically majoring in that guy. I was a PE major, and I thought PE would be the easiest degree to keep me eligible. You know, I found out later you had recreation degree too. It had all the games and none of the sciences. So PE was kind of challenging as far as sciences go. But I took every course this philosophy prof offered but one. And he opened my eyes to more. And then he also told me he thought I had a brain and I could write. Nobody ever told me they thought I had a brain. You know, I got my first D in third grade and nobody was even upset about it because I think they were surprised I did that well. So I'm reading Lewis voraciously. I'm buying the books. You could get first editions dirt cheap back then and so on. So then I end up going to seminary and I have to write a thesis. My heavens, the longest paper I think I wrote in college was 5 pages in crayon, and here now I have to write a thesis, and I'm not going to write it on the use of the optative mood in the Greek text of Philemon. That's not going to hold me. I asked if I could write on Lewis, and they said yes. By the way, when I left college, a man wisely said to me, "You do not get an education in college." I thought, wow, I'm wasting my time here. What am I doing here then? He says, no, you lay a foundation for an education. And we call graduation commencement, which means you're now going to commence your education by building on that foundation. Pick an author who will take you places, make him your life study. I think he could have said, pick a composer, pick an artist, pick a period of history, something like this. But I picked Lewis, and I then put pen to paper when I wrote that thesis in grad school, and I've been writing on him ever since, studying him. So that's kind of how it emerged, from a conversation with my sister over dinner to people who encouraged me along the way with the idea of commencement and so on.
Is that kind of when the transition then happened for you to kind of speaking about it academically or kind of pursuing that?
Well, when I was in seminary, of course, you start writing papers. I mean, every once in a while I run across on some file a paper I wrote in seminary, and I'm going, this would not have attracted anybody. There was pretty thin soup, but I think it has to do with the nature of truth itself. Um, I think we can have a sure word about something. We could speak of it with confidence, but any truth we know could still be plumbed deeper. It could be applied wider, even to questions we haven't even considered yet. And so consequently, it can go deeper and wider. So we speak the sure word with confidence, but hold it in an open hand of humility, because we know we'll never get to the bottom of this thing. And it shouldn't surprise us. It's like the great theologian Lucy Pevensey. Perhaps you encountered her in the Narnian books. So when she sees Aslan, the Christ figure of Narnia, for the first time on her second trip into Narnia, she exclaims, Aslan, you're bigger. He says, no, child, I am not. But every year you grow, you'll find me bigger. And you have all these people who have truncated development spiritually because they think they've got it all figured out. Walter Elwell, who was a brilliant theologian at Wheaton College years ago and a very close friend, we used to meet for lunch every week for 9.5 years. And I feel like I learned so much around his table. And a group of us, there were probably about 5 to 8 of us that would meet there each week. He once said, all theology is approximation. And what we seek are better and better approximations. God is big, and we're pea brains. We want to get our minds around him. None of us are going to get our minds around him, but each of us could explore more deeply. And if we're exploring well, it will constantly be an experience that will take our breath away. Wow, I had no idea. Wow, this is intriguing. Lord, oh Lord, I love you. I've described it to somebody the other day like this. I feel more in love with God than I've ever felt in my own life. And I feel like I tell him at night, I try and make it my last prayer of the day. Lord, I love you. I don't love you very well, but I'm grateful that you make it so easy for me to love you at all. And the more I try to move into his light and the light of his grace, the more it reveals dark stuff in my life that still has not been fixed. And yet it also then reveals to me in that moment how his light is willing to go to those dark places. And I love him for it, and I'm grateful.
Yeah, my daughter's name is Lucy for that very reason. So
Yeah, that's great.
yeah,
I have a niece named Lucy. It's good. It means light. It means light.
yeah,
Good name.
yeah. I was gonna say I think it's a name. I think sometimes it's so heavy to put a name on a child, but then it's like just that light joy and that acceptance of God, that wonder of God is such a beautiful thing. It's like, man, I hope that for your life. Um, so speaking,
Don't let her have an unprayed for day.
yeah,
Don't let
yeah,
her
exactly.
for a day.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like growing up in the church, I was so used to having people like pray for me, or you ask for requests and you can pray for other people, but then like when you're holding a little baby and you're like, I don't even know where to start, but just like, all right, let's start praying right now. I'm already laying hands because it's 4 a.m. and I'm trying to rock you to sleep. But
It's
um,
everything. I think the place to start. There was a time when Jesus was asked, "What's the most important thing I could do with my life?" He was asked, "What's the greatest commandment?" And he says, "Love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind." I think that's always a place where you could start praying for somebody. Lord, help this person discover the most important thing for his or her life. Help them to fall in love with you, which means overwhelm them by removing any abstraction from them seeing how much you love them. Pray for that every day for your daughter. That's a great place to begin to pray. Yeah. It's
Yeah, I will.
interesting.
Thank you.
It's interesting. C.S. Lewis was a letter came to him through his publisher from a little girl, 11 years old, named Ruth. It's in his letters to children. Came within about 3 weeks before he died. It's one of the last things he ever wrote was his response to this girl's letter. She's 11 on the threshold of life. Here's this great Christian scholar on the threshold of death. He would die 3 weeks later. And he writes to her and he says, if you continue to love Jesus, nothing much will go wrong with you. And I pray you may always do so. That's a good prayer.
Yeah, it's a powerful last letter from him too.
Yeah.
And um, what do you have a specific like Chronicles of Narnia book that really speaks to you?
Well, I love the Chronicles of Narnia, and I like them all. And usually I say to somebody, if they ask me, what's your favorite Lewis book, I say whichever one I'm reading at that moment, because I read them over and over. But probably the one that's gotten to me the most is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, because here is Reepicheep longing to go to Aslan's country. And that particular book, I think, um, spells out for us something of what we encountered in Surprised by Joy. This man questing to find the object of his deep longings. And I think I like that book because it speaks to the longing in my heart for God. You know, in my best moments, there are times when we get distracted, of course, but I think it's Reepicheep and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, longing to go to Aslan's country.
Yeah, I was gonna say it almost kind of fits back with that, you know, praying over your child because Reepicheep has had that since he was in his nursery, in his crib. It's like this rhyme was over me, this searching for the
Prophecy.
country.
There's other things too, because you end up, there once was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. And Eustace has the heart of a dragon under the skin of a little boy, and he becomes dragoned in that book. And the reality occurs, and he has to be undragoned. And as we read that, maybe we see in the mirror of that passage that there are parts of our life that need to be undragoned yet. And yet Aslan is faithful, and he works, he trims away, he cuts through all that dragon flesh and gets that dragon heart and makes us real again. And then you've got also when Lucy comes to the island of the voices where the dufflepuds are. They're really monopods, but they can't even get their own identity right. And they need to be made visible. And she goes up into the magician's library and she reads from the spell of the magician's book. And she reads first the spell, how to make one more beautiful beyond the lot of mortals. And she's tempted to say that spell, and Aslan comes out of the screen and stops her. And then she sees the spell, how to listen in on what people are saying about you when you're not there. And she just rushes in and says that one because she got over the one temptation, not by her own effort, but by Aslan asserting himself. So she feels like she's due this other one. So she just says it. And she has this terrible experience hearing a friend of hers be goaded by her arch enemy to say something mean about her. And then she's just depressed. She comes to another book on the spell for the refreshment of the spirit. And it goes for 3 days, three pages. And as she says, that's the most beautiful story I've ever read. She wants to go back and read it. And she finds from that story, you can only go forward. You can't go back. She tries to remember what it's about. And it was about a green hill and a tree and a sword and a cup. And she finally comes to the spell for making things visible. And Aslan's right there. He's been there all along. She just didn't know. He says, don't you think I'd abide by my own rules? So she says to him, Aslan, would you tell me the story that was in the book? And he says, that's a story I will tell you forever and ever and ever. It's a gospel story. Goes on for 3 pages, like Jesus' death and burial goes on for 3 days. It was about a hill, Calvary, about a tree, the cross, about the cup that he was willing to drink and the sword, the death he was willing to die. It's a gospel story. And it's so intriguingly portrayed in that book. Here again, the longing to have what's broken in us fixed. It comes through this idea of Lucy then being restored, and that restoration again, leading to the longing to want to know more. It's not just an encounter with Christ. It's Malcolm Muggeridge wrote a book called The 20th Century Testimony. Tom Howard wrote the introduction to it. And he said, if you ask Malcolm Muggeridge when he decided for Christ, he said, I think Malcolm Muggeridge would sidestep the question. He said, do you mean when did I make the decision to try to make every decision for Christ from that point on? And that's the point, I think. We make the decision to follow Jesus, and it's a decision to want to perpetually be following him. And we get our fits and starts, but nevertheless, as time passes, we start walking more consistently with these things, always seeing there's more to be done, more work to be done.
Yeah, I think it's almost that idea of some things are meant to be wrestled with.
Yeah.
You know,
That you get
why does God allow bad things to happen? You know, I think that's something we're supposed to wrestle with, not.
you get it in Scripture. So here's Jacob, and he's coming back, and his brother's coming with 400 troops. And the last time he saw his brother, he wanted to kill him. It's been 20 years. And that night he wrestles all night with the angel of the Lord. And dawn begins to break. And the angel of the Lord says, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. He says, I will not let you go unless you bless me. There's such tenacity there. God says, okay, here's my blessing to you. No longer do I call you Jacob. I call you Israel. And what does Israel mean? He who wrestles with God. There's a blessing in the wrestling because we see that there's more to him than we first imagined. It's amazing.
What part of Lewis's writings or teachings have had like the most profound effect on you?
Well, I think something so basic to him is his call for people to walk in the truth. In the 1930s, he was giving a lecture to his students at Oxford, and it's in a book called Rehabilitations, and the lecture is called on the English Syllabus. And he said to them, we fulfilled our whole duty to you if we can help you see some given track of reality. In other words, here's a book you're going to study. Let's say it's Milton's Paradise Lost. And when you study it, the temptation will be for you to project your own ideas on that book. But what you want to do is see the reality for what it is, draw out of the book what's in there. In other words, learn truth from it. Truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. The real world is there, independent of my thoughts about it. We are knowers, and there's something to be known. And if we're going to grow out of our own subjectivism, we need to be open to that reality. He says in The Experiment in Criticism, one of his last books he wrote, certainly one of his last literary critical books, he says, in coming to understand anything, we must reject the facts as they are for us in favor of the facts as they are. And that was part of Lewis's own experience. When he rejected the faith of his childhood after his mother died, well-meaning people said, oh, you pray for her, she'll get better. You can't give that guarantee to a child. But they said, you pray for her, she'll get better. He prayed for her as a 9-year-old as if her survival would depend upon his prayers, and she died. And he said, I came to think, if there is a God, he doesn't really matter that much. It wasn't long after that he became an atheist. By the time he was 12, he said he was an atheist. The God that Lewis rejected was not the God of the Bible, was not the God of the universe. It was the God of that misinformation that was fed him. Arnold Toynbee, the historian, said, most people don't reject Christianity. They reject poor caricatures of Christianity. Lewis says, I want reality, not what I think about reality. I want it as it is. And he writes a whole book about this called The Abolition of Man. And he talks about the Tao as the doctrine of objective value. He uses an Eastern word for this, not because he thinks this is Eastern, but he wants to show that it's not merely Western. This is something where there's a real world that exists independent of my thoughts about it, and I need to bring my thoughts up to speed with that real world and see that my understanding should be dynamic because that world is big and God who created it is massive. And every place where you look in a world that he's created is in some senses a call to worship. And we look and we see. So the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain things are really true and others really false, the kind of thing we are, the kind of thing the universe is. So back to this idea about truth and reality. So truth is what I think about reality, but what I need to do is think accurately. And again, he said this in this lecture. He said it at the end of his academic career. He's still citing the same things, and in the middle of his academic career, abolition of man. So think about it today. We have a word called symbol. It comes from two Greek words, soon, with, and bole, to cast. So I take an object. Here, this is a pen. All right, I call it a pen. I could have called it a Gesortenblatt. The word pen is arbitrary at first, but I throw the word together with the object, and now I don't have to have one of these with me to talk about a pen. You know that a pen, whether it's a fountain pen or a feather quill pen or a ballpoint pen, you know that it's a writing object that you can compose with and so on. So anyway, the word initially is arbitrary, but if you're going to have language and if you're going to have communication, it can no longer be arbitrary. It has to be making it possible for communication, which also makes it possible for community and culture. But we live in a world now where you can use whatever pronoun you want. You can be whatever gender you want. And all of a sudden, words don't represent objects universally. And consequently, we've fallen into Babel once again, like in the Bible. And we have confusion. We have chaos. We have breakdown of community, loss of language. Words don't mean the same for different people. And Lewis is saying, this is tragic. You've got to get back to this concept of reality, this concept of truth. And he writes about it in a work of fiction too, That Hideous Strength. If you read that book, it's so prescient. He's describing what we're seeing going on in our culture right now. And it's because of, again, the inability to understand the nature of truth, the inability to be able to communicate truth, and the inability then to be able to have community and culture. This is not something that's arbitrary. It's something that's substantive, and it should be universal. So that to me is huge in Lewis. And I think that's really helped me as an academic to think through issues related to truth, to think through issues related to discovery, to think through issues related to developing an idea that I finally understood, and to see its applications in other areas and so on. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Do you experience that a lot? The argument of there is no truth. It's whatever you feel like
Yeah,
in your lecturing.
well, not so much in my lecturing. I lectured at a Christian college where there were really bright students, and they were, they didn't have those kinds of problems, but you run into it all the time. I mean, I talk to people all the time, and I love to engage in evangelistic discussions and so on. I'm not an evangelist. My spiritual gift is a gift of encouragement. I teach to encourage students. I share Christ to encourage the non-believer, and I share Christ and encourage believers to share Christ because I think that they'll live a more mature Christian life if they're giving of themselves to others. But yeah, once in a while you'll run into somebody that says, you can't know truth. And I go, really? Is that true? I mean, the whole thing is an inherent contradiction, and you can't build sense out of a contradiction. It's nonsense. And you wonder, and I'll challenge people. I'll say, how did you ever come up with thinking that that is fair-mindedness? And sometimes you have to shake people up a little bit. I think generally the gingerly kind, careful, tender approach is best. But sometimes you get people who are so irrational It's almost like they need electric shock treatment to break them out of their nonsense. And so sometimes you confront them. But yeah, no, I don't see that very often, but when it comes up, I go for it.
Yeah, there does seem to be this kind of wave of Christians being like, well, let's be nice. We even if you don't agree, let's just be nice and have a, accept people. And I think that's a great starting point, but then not relaying truth is a huge misstep.
And you're not really being nice if you marginalize truth. You're being somewhat self-referential. You're more concerned about your own reputation at that point. We should be gentle and we should speak the truth in love, but it should never be at the sacrifice of truth. You get people, you understand them. You've got a husband, a father and mother, and they have a child who's drifted towards same-sex relationships, or they have a daughter who's had an abortion, and the scriptures are clear on these things. And we don't read the Bible, so sometimes we're not even aware of these things, but the scriptures are clear. And when a person tells me, well, yeah, but it's my son or it's my daughter, I say, I praise you for being concerned about your son or daughter, but I don't think you're helping them. If you saw a person who was anorexic and they thought they were fat and they were starving themselves to death, would you say you really shouldn't live that way? You're going to take your life. What you're doing is harmful to you. So somehow you've got to stick up for this stuff because people are going down a path that's leading to destruction of their souls. And so I say to those parents who are concerned, I say, you need to at least treat this the way Jesus treated it. And they go, well, when did he ever talk about same-sex attraction or abortion or any of these things? I said, there was a woman brought to him, thrown before him, who had been caught in the very act of adultery. And you go, I don't know what they did with the guy. How come they didn't bring the guy too? And the religious leaders are saying, Moses commanded us to stone such a one. What do you say? Jesus is writing in the sand. I don't know what he was writing. I think he was probably embarrassed for the woman. She was caught in the very act, and she was probably scantily clothed. They keep pressing him. And Jesus says, let him who's without sin cast the first stone. He doesn't append to that. Moses also wrote that. So you guys are only selective in your application of the Old Testament. And the people realize what they've done is wrong. They start peeling off. And finally, it's just Jesus and the woman. And he looks at her and he said, did no one condemn you? She says, no one, Lord. He says, neither do I condemn you. There's the love. Go your way and sin no more. There's the truth. And if you think you have love without truth, you've got condoning, not love. And if you have truth without love, you've got harsh, censorious, critical attitude that doesn't balance the way God balances his truth and love. So I think that we need to try and work for that. I think Lewis gives multiple examples of it throughout his writing, and even you see it in his letters. There was one guy, Paul Ford, who combed through all of Lewis's letters that were available, and he put out a book called Yours, Jack. And it's a thick volume of all the letters that Lewis wrote that could be considered letters of spiritual direction. And they are full of truth and love. He doesn't pull punches, but he doesn't stop loving and nurturing and encouraging. So I think that's what we have to do. God help us. And we usually don't do it well. We usually bump and bruise around until finally we start to get better and better at it. We learn skill. Like an athlete who's competing in a sport, they don't go out the first day of practice and think they can do things. They got to get beat up and banged around a little bit, but learn from their experiences so that they get more proficient and pick up the skill.
Is there anything from Lewis's writings that you specifically hold on to during like hard times or?
My mind is like a pickle soaking in the brine of C.S. Lewis. I've been reading him for so long. So virtually everything I've read is sort of floating around in there somewhere. So I don't think there's just one thing. And that's a good thing about Lewis, too. He says, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. For Lewis, it's not just faith integrated liberal arts education, it's faith integrated life. And I think that this helps me to recognize God is present, God is active in these circumstances. If you don't understand in this moment, don't don't pull away. Lean into it until the clarity begins to come. And as I said a minute ago, it's like learning a skill. You don't learn the skill if you bail every time you struggle. You got to keep leaning in there and keep learning. Ask forgiveness where you need to ask forgiveness. Um, Record and remember what was good so that it might be useful for you the next time you face that situation. There should be development. Aslan, you're bigger, no child I'm not, but every year you grow, you'll find me bigger. It's that kind of thing again.
I think definitely Lewis is somebody that helps to lift our eyes, to wake up a bit. We talked about how I do construction and I sometimes need that because I'm looking at flooring all day, and I'm like, oh, I need something to like raise me heavenward, look up, look what's going around, and Lewis is such a great way to like inspire our faith
And
and our life.
even to bring heaven down to the laying of floor. God is present there. There's no place where you could go where he is not. And there's nothing you're doing that he's not interested in because he's interested in you and what you do. I think that becomes significant as well.
This is kind of a heavier question, I guess, but what do you think is the most important Lewis like teaching that we need right now, like that needs to survive Lewis beyond even me and you? Like, what's a Lewis, you know?
Well, even what we talked about, the nature of truth and its application to life, I think that's significant. And I think that we are neglectful of these things. You ask the average student what the nature of truth is. Can you define truth for me? They're clueless. They're saying all the time this is true, that's false. But then when you say, okay, Lewis says all judgments imply a standard. What's your standard for measuring whether it's true or false? And if you don't know the standard, then you'll find you're just basically self-referential and projecting your likes and dislikes on them. You said Lewis helps you to see things better. The epilogue of experiment and criticism, Lewis even says, my own eyes are not enough for me. I would see what others have seen. I would read what they've written. Even that's not enough for me. I would read what they've imagined. Even that's not enough for me. I regret that the brutes cannot write books. Gladly would I see how the world comes, presented to the eye of a mouse or a bee, or how it comes charged to the olfactory sense of a dog. There's a humility in that. There's a realizing that we don't know everything, that we have great and severe limits. We can know some things, have confidence. You don't know everything, have humility. So consequently, keep your eyes open and be like a sponge trying to pick up and learn everywhere you can, even from your own mistakes, even from the mistakes of others, even from your own successes and the successes of others. There's room to grow, and everywhere you grow, you'll find Aslan bigger. And all growth should lead to something that ends in worship, adoration, praise, and worship. You were a worship leader, so you want people to come to service prepared to express themselves in the worship of the God they've been discovering more and more of that week.
Yeah, I think Lewis, I feel like drops, especially in the Narnia series, he'll drop so many nuggets of wisdom that are just a glance, just like, oh no, every year I'm bigger, and just because the more you know me, the bigger I get. And it's just like, and then you move on. And it's like, wait, can we just stop, and just
Yeah.
so many of those things just stop you, and just stand you in place. And it's amazing.
And they're worth rereading too. Lewis says that a good book is worth rereading, and that a literary person reads a book more than once. Now, not all books maybe are worth rereading, but there's a book in the library. We have Lewis's library here at Wheaton College, and you can go through and read all his marginalia. It's the biggest collection of Lewis material in the world. And after he read Don Juan by Lord Byron, he wrote the date he finished it, and right beneath it he wrote, "Never again." So at least Lewis felt that book wasn't worth rereading. But a good book is worth rereading. I mean, I just reread Dante recently. I reread Boethius recently. I reread these books. They're precious to me. I'm reading new books too. I read um, The Dean's Watch by Elizabeth Goudge. I just read that book. I just finished it 2 days ago. And fascinating. So we keep rereading. And scripture too. Every time you read scripture, you say, well, where was that last time I read through it? Good books have depths like that, and they take you to these places. And I think it keeps you excited about the world that God has placed you in.
Yeah, we had this just this idea of Lewis, he wakes us up with his words. He gets excited about our day to day. I think he really had a lot of pushback on that kind of materialism of the world. And I think modern Christianity kind of struggles with that. Um, Trying to explain away mystery with rationalism. Do you see Lewis kind of fighting back against that
Well,
with mystery and wonder?
here's the thing. I think our faith should be rational. It shouldn't be nonsensical. So I don't want to put reason and mystery in opposition. And even Lewis says faith is not in opposition to reason. Faith is in opposition to my pride, my greed, my lust, my envy. It's not in opposition to reason. So I want to be reasonable, but I want to make sure, though, that I am being reasonable. I'm not rationalizing my own stupidity. Sometimes we can think our rationalizations are so good that we've got it figured out. There are mysteries of faith. There are things I know now that I had no clue about when I was a brand new believer. So I don't want to play the mystery card too quickly either, because it might keep me from really thinking strongly about what I need to be thinking about. We're called to truth in Scripture. So um, I hold the mystery in my hand, knowing that this may be a mystery that I won't know about till I get to heaven. There will be mysteries that we'll never plumb the depths of. If God's infinite, then my guess is there will always be new discoveries even in heaven. It'll be a time that takes our breath away. But there are some things that I call mystery now that aren't going to be mysteries for me 10 years from now. They'll still be intriguing. They'll still be prompters of worship, but they won't be mysteries. So I don't know if it's a mystery or if it's just my immaturity that I haven't discovered yet what it is. But I read the mystics. I like the mystics. I'm a big fan of Evelyn Underhill. I got to her through Lewis. Again, he opens more than wardrobe doors. And she writes stuff that, have you ever read A.W. Tozer?
No, I have not.
A.W. Tozer will take your breath away. Evelyn Underhill is A.W. Tozer on steroids. And it's brilliant stuff. And I read it and I love it. But the mysteries that she writes about are mysteries that are not nonsensical. But they are mysteries that provoke the heart and create in me a sense of wonder and hunger and wanting to grow more. So I don't think that the reason and mystery are antithetical. The other thing, though, too, is you talked about materialism. So Lewis, when he became an atheist, needed a worldview to support his atheism. And he became a materialist. He writes about it in Surprised by Joy. He writes about what he discovered in the process in his book, Miracles, where he's setting forth an argument for supernaturalism as opposed to materialism. And when Lewis was a materialist, he said that the materialists wanted you to believe that a man doesn't really love a woman. He looks at a woman, she projects an image on the retina of his eye, it travels along the optic nerve, stimulating the brain, causing the response of the secretion of hormones. He says it's love, it's just matter, just material. But the materialist, when he says it, is a hypocrite, because he is trying to give you an answer for something But he looked at the lovers, they projected an image on the retina of his eye, the message traveled along his optic nerve, stimulated his brain, caused secretion of particular hormones, and he says explanation. He wants you to believe his explanation is legitimate, but the lover's love is not. He's a hypocrite. And Lewis says, I cannot believe reason is mere cerebral biochemistry. And he says there's more here. And he realized the materialist answer is insufficient and it couldn't account for the world as Lewis was experiencing it. So he rejects that materialism, but then if materialism is wrong, then these longings that he has for some object must be real or might be real, but they shouldn't be dismissed just because it's chemistry. And consequently, it set him back on his quest where eventually he works through his atheism, his agnosticism, his materialism. He becomes a theist. He believes there's got to be something transcendent that's out there. And at that point in his life, of course, his friendship with Tolkien was pretty robust. And Lewis, in his own thinking, he writes about it in Surprised by Joy, he said he didn't think he could know God personally any more than Hamlet could know Shakespeare. But then he had a long night talk with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson. And they said, man, Lewis, you love the myths wherever you meet them, the mysteries and the myths. You love the stories of the gods coming down to us. How come you won't accept it at the one place where it reports itself to be historic and true? And so he goes back to his metaphor of Hamlet and Shakespeare, and he realizes if Hamlet's ever going to get to know Shakespeare, he can't tear himself out of the play to get to know the author. But Shakespeare, the author, could have written himself into the play as a character and made the introduction possible. And Lewis goes, that's it. That's it. That was the incarnation. God wrote himself into the play of our human experience. And he gave us his word. He gave us then the writing and put it in our laps as well. And so you can discover that. That's a start. But there's so much more. So you keep growing, you read the word, you find out more in your own personal experience with scripture, personal experience with Christ, and you grow, and it's breathtaking. So Lewis rejected materialism soundly, but he rejected it because he thought about it reasonably. And he saw materialism itself was irrational. And you don't want to embrace irrationality, and you don't want your sense of mystery to be irrational either. There may be things you don't understand, but the things that you don't understand shouldn't be irrational.
You really made me think just now because I didn't even realize it until you replied to my question that I was viewing those as opposing things.
Yeah.
It's rationalism or a mystery. I saw a lot of things growing up in my own like church life, and that I would see people, I had a fight with my wife and I just went outside and I prayed about it, and I did that thing, but they never connected with their spouse. They never healed the brokenness. It's like, I'm just going to go worship. Amazing. Glad you're worshiping God, but you have to fix what's broken. You have to fix the relationship. It's like, and the excuse of, oh, I'm good with God, but the relationships around me are falling apart. um and I guess I saw that in that kind of the view of rationalism and mystery. Like, where is the connection for God meet the practical? And
Well,
why does it have to be
that
separate?
problem is one not of reason and mystery. That's a problem of disobedience. If you see that you want to go worship and you come to the altar and you realize you have an unresolved conflict with a brother, you need to go set that right. Scriptures are clear. So that person is just using that as, again, rationalization to maintain their behavior and not fix their behavior. And that is to truncate their own spiritual development. They may be a real believer. I mean, you look at the scriptures. Again, I read them over and over again. Everybody, almost, there are some exceptions, but almost everybody I meet in scripture could have introduced themselves in some kind of a recovery group. Hi, my name's Noah and I'm a drunk. Hi, my name's Abraham, and I would tell a lie that would put my wife's life at risk rather than risk anything myself. Hi, my name is Miriam, and I'm jealous of my little brother Moses, and I'm a racist. I'm upset about his interracial marriage. Hi, my name is Aaron, and I'm a religious leader, but I caved to peer pressure. Hi, my name's Moses. I'm a hothead and a murderer. Hi, my name's Rahab. I'm a harlot. Hi, my name is Naomi, and I'm bitter. Hi, my name's Samson. I struggle with lust. Hi, my name's David. I'm a man after God's own heart, but I'm an adulterer and a murderer. Hi, my name's Solomon. I'm supposed to be wise, but I don't even know if I really obeyed everything I wrote in the book of Proverbs, and I know my son didn't. Hi, my name is uh, Elijah, and I struggle with depression. Hi, my name is Thomas, and I'm a doubter. Hi, my name is Peter. I let down my best friend at a time he needed me most. Hi, my name is Paul. I'm a Christian killer, and I'm really hard to work with. I mean, there they all are. These are strugglers. And you know, when I read that, you know what I say to myself? That's my tribe. I can identify with those people. And consequently, I say there's room for me in that tribe, and there's room for me to grow and not stay stuck in that place. Because all those people that I described for you are heroes of our faith. They didn't stay stuck in that place. They grew. And that's what we need to do. So if this guy has an argument with his wife and says, well, I went and prayed and I went and worshiped, everything's fine, but he didn't straighten out anything with his wife. He chose not to learn and grow in his marriage. That's sad to me because he could have had better. And he's the loser at that particular point. And we have to hope that maybe that occurred at a point in his life, but it didn't perpetually occur throughout his life. Maybe he learned through that too. Great thing about the Holy Spirit, he doesn't let us get away with much. My life was a lot easier before I was a Christian because I didn't have the Holy Spirit hounding me all the time, pointing out to me where I fall short. But that's a gift. That's a gift.
Yeah, and I think it's also, I don't want to put, that's between them and God, but those are things I saw that made me struggle with that. And just such a beautiful thought about we use our rationalism with our, viewing of mystery, that they can be used together to check each other, I guess.
And the thing you struggled with then, if you were tempted to maybe reject that faith because of those things you saw, you wouldn't be rejecting the faith. You'd be rejecting a poor caricature of faith. And you don't want to give up on the real for the artificial. There's a line from Thomas Aquinas. I got to remember it. My wife says my mind's like lightning, one flash, then total darkness. Um, an abuse does not justify. How's it go? An abuse does not justify the rejection of a proper use. So if you rejected any group of people or anything by virtue of its worst examples, nobody could stand. You can always see a bad professor. You can see a bad politician, a bad used car salesman, bad lawyer, whatever the case might be. You don't want to reject all for the sake of that one. It's interesting. C.S. Lewis wrote that book, English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama. That was the century of the Reformation. He has about 100 pages in that book on the writings of religious controversy. And he's the only guy I know that read thoroughly both sides of the Reformation, the Catholic side and the Protestant side. And his conclusion is more nuanced because it's more informed. He's not reading a little bit and then making these universal sweeping generalizations. And Lewis said that the Catholics thought that the Protestants were antinomian, against the law. The Protestants thought the Catholics were Pelagian, works-oriented, you earn your way to God. He said both were wrong. You could find a Pelagian among the Catholics and you could find an antinomian among the Protestants, but you had to bottom fish to find it. So if I'm arguing my point against the worst of the other side, that's not strengthening my point. I need to argue against the best of the other side if I want to show that my point is strong. And a lot of times when I find the best of the other side, there's maybe less difference between us than I'm willing to acknowledge. I come to the argument already prepared to reject the other side for some reason. So Lewis helps us in that regard. He's more nuanced, I think. So an abuse does not nullify a proper use, is the way Aquinas said it. An abuse does not nullify a proper use.
I can even see that politically. Like, I mean, it's so, when people spew hate on the other side of their voting, it seems so much like we're talking about characters of each other, caricatures, like the worst,
My,
and
my doctoral supervisor, my first supervisor, I had great supervisors, but my first supervisor was a man named Basil Mitchell. He was a philosopher at Oxford University, an eminent philosopher. He met with Lewis every week for lunch during term. He was the vice president of the Socratic Club. Lewis was the president. When Lewis goes to Cambridge, Mitchell becomes the president of Socratic Club. He said, we can't get neutral, and we shouldn't try to be neutral. Your life is informed by your experiences, by your relationships, by your reading, all sorts of things. So you're not going to be neutral. You're going to hear something and you're going to filter it through your grid. That's not necessarily bad, but realizing that we can't get neutral and wanting to understand others as best we can, we should strive for impartiality. And Mitchell said impartiality is achieved when I could say back to the other person in a way they find acceptable what their point of view was. So if my wife Claudia says this to me and I hear this, we miss each other completely. So then 3 days later, I say, hey, Claudia, do you remember when you said this to me? She said, I never said that to you. And I say, now it's a matter of integrity. I was in the room. I heard you. No, I didn't hear her. I heard her through my grid. So I achieve impartiality by giving her veto power over my perspective. I say, Claudia, is this what you meant? She says, no. Give it to me again. I don't always get it right. She says, yeah, we've established that frequently in this relationship. I say, give it to me again. She gives it to me again. I say it back. I say, is this it? She says, that's better, but that's still not quite it. She says it again. I say, is this it? She says, yes, that's it. A lot of times that solves the conflict. Sometimes it doesn't. But if it doesn't, then we can move someplace that is meaningful. And I can say that makes a lot of sense given A, B, and C, but were you aware of X, Y, and Z? She might say, no, I wasn't. Or she might say, yes, I was. Were you aware of L, M, N, O, and P? But now it's meaningful conversation where I'm beginning to understand what the other person's concerns are. And then I can begin to say, I don't know if your concerns are actually being addressed in the way you're looking at this. Have you considered? Then we start talking and we assume. Plato said that Socrates had said, no men do evil knowingly. No men do evil knowingly. They've either rationalized their bad event, their bad thinking, so that they think it's right, or else they didn't know, and so they held a view, but they held a view that was uninformed by wisdom or insight or understanding of truth. So let's assume that this other person is not doing evil knowingly. I think there are evil people out there, don't get me wrong. They have to be dealt with in a different way. But if I begin with the assumption this person's probably doing the best they know how, then we move on from there in a way that we can have a real discussion. And I think you're right. We live in an age where we don't do that. And part of it is because we're watching the news. The news always tries to portray the worst of somebody. We learned in school about the industrialists who were tough to the workers, but not all industrialists were. A lot of industrialists took risks to start their businesses and created jobs for people so that they could make a meaningful living and feed their families and so on. But you had the exceptional ones who were noteworthy. And the response to them created the unions. But the unions weren't pure as the driven snow either. There were a lot of good ones in the unions, but the unions sometimes abused power as well. So consequently, we begin to see that there were good among these people, but the media or the read of history often gravitates towards the worst example. And consequently, it's spoken of as if we begin to assume that all are worst. And that's false. And it causes us to be less patient with other people, less willing to listen, and so on. So anyway, that's my pontification about that.
It made me think of I was having a discussion with my wife, and I remember her saying to me, "Don't take this personal. Don't get defensive. Just I need you to hear me." And I remember trying so hard to like just don't take it personal. Just listen. Put your feelings aside. Don't try to. Oh well, no. The reason I did that. And then, man, just sitting there listening, I heard, understood, and I'm like, it's so hard. Why can't we do that with everyone that we disagree with? If we could actually sit down and listen.
I think the reason why we can't is we are basically insecure and we don't realize God loves us. It's again Lewis's letter to the little girl. I pray that that you will uh, I pray that you'll be active. No, 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 doggone it. I just gave it to you a minute ago, the letter from Ruth. Anyway, the idea that if I know that I'm loved of God, then my security doesn't rest in my being triumphant in this moment of discussion. My security rests in the love of God. And I can be willing even to make mistakes and learn from them and grow in them. I can learn the art of confession and so on. So I think the biggest reason why we do these things is we're not secure in the love of God. Um, so anyway, that's what I think is the problem. I believe this too. I think Lewis was wrong at this point. Mere Christianity, he says he thinks pride is the great sin. I don't believe that's true. I believe there's something more substantive than that. Had he said he thought pride was a great sin, like the apex of a pyramid is the greatest point in the pyramid, I could have signed on. But beneath that apex are things more substantive till you get to the base. What precedes pride? And I'm not talking about the pride of a job well done or pride you take when you see your children do something and put the refrigerator magnet up on the fridge, the picture, it's a refrigerator magnet. I'm talking about that form of pride that exhibits itself as pretense, portrays itself as more than it really is. Well, when I think about that in my life, when I do stuff like that, it's usually preceded by insecurity or fear. If you knew me like I really was, you might reject me. So I put some sort of pretense over that fear. Well, if that's true, then what's beneath the fear is clear. 1 John 4:19 says, perfect love casts out fear. That means at the base of the pyramid, I think, is to live in neglect of or ignorance of God's love for me. And Jesus is even asked, what's the most important thing I can do with my life? What's the greatest commandment? And he says, love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, 1 John again says, we love because he first loved us. We don't start by trying to manufacture love for others in our own heart. We start by responding to God's love for us. He's the sun, we're the moon. We receive the light of his love and we're to reflect it towards others. So I think that and real love too. I'm not talking about condoning. I'm not talking about hanging rainbow flags outside of our church and thinking that we're loving people while we do that, discarding truth. That doesn't help them any more than I'm, again, helping the anorexic by letting them believe the delusion that they're fat. We want to pray for people who are struggling with same-sex identity and same-sex attraction. We pray for them. We love them. If you hung the rainbow flag up outside your church because you said all are welcome here, that's fair. But if you come as you are. But if you come and really encounter Christ, we don't expect you to stay as you are. Aslan, you're bigger. And my life should be changing to be brought into conformity with your love and your grace and your forgiveness and your truth. So those are things that in our culture we're neglecting, and consequently, the symptoms of that are all these sorts of things that we're talking about, our inability to get along, our inability to talk civilly in a political conflict. Instead of saying to this person who comes up with some egregious statement that seems so far from the reality that we've studied, we just start jumping on them and instead of saying, well, I've known you for a while and you're a reasonable person. Tell me why you think the way you think, and enter into a real discussion with them. But instead we just jump on it. Very seldom especially when we don't really have news anymore. We have talking heads arguing with each other. And we don't define terms. We don't get back to brass tacks. We don't move inferentially in a coherent, sequential um, uh, way through our thinking and our discussion. And it's sad. Reading Lewis is a good antidote to that. He begins with definitions. He reasons in an inferentially coherent way from those definitions to sound conclusions that are convincing. That's why you like Mere Christianity. He's making those kinds of arguments. And he depicts them in a way that we can get our minds and our hearts imaginatively around those things. I think that's important.
Well said. Um, this is kind of a out of left field question here, but I'm seeing a lot of people in I just like a lot of podcasts, a lot of current authors in just like a younger generation kind of diving back into some apocryphal literature, like the Book of Enoch, um, talking about the Nephilim. And I didn't find anything that Lewis had said about it, but I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, if you see danger in that, if you see, positives or anything like that.
Well, it's hard for me to comment on it because I haven't read any of that. I remember in college I read The Shepherd of Hermas. I read the Gospel of Barnabas, was it? I don't even remember read some of the Apocrypha and stuff, but that was ages ago. And I remember even reading some of the Eastern literature, the Vedas and the Upanishads and so on. I didn't find it particularly nourishing, so I moved on to things that I found more nourishing. So I really couldn't comment much on this, but I could say if somebody's reading it and they seem to be obsessing with it, I could say, well, tell me about your obsession. I wouldn't probably use the word obsession. I say, well, tell me about your interests. And as they talk, then I would begin to see if I could find some symptom in their description that maybe is healthy. I led a guy to Christ years ago who was a Buddhist, and he had studied with the Dalai Lama in Nepal. And I didn't know anything about Tibetan Buddhism at that time. But I prayed for this guy and I loved him, and we would meet twice a week, Tuesday mornings for breakfast, and he would come to our house Monday nights for dinner. And over about 9 months, he came to Christ. And I just would listen to him, listen to what he had to say, believing that his life mattered. He went on to become a medical doctor. He's since written a book about C.S. Lewis, actually, on C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. So we begin with the assumption this is a person for whom Christ died, a person that he deeply loves. And consequently, as a result of that, we can have some substantive conversation. Doesn't always go well, but oftentimes it goes better than we might have imagined had we not just jumped in and gotten down the throat of that person. So sometimes you have to. Sometimes the ideas are so outlandish. You've got to say, "Come on, this is ridiculous." But most of the time, I think people again, uh, they don't do wrong and they don't think wrong um, purposefully. They've gravitated towards this. So this guy, by the way, this Buddhist guy, his quest for Buddhism was he was hungry for God. And he went that route for a while in Buddhism, and he found it wasn't there. So it's like C.S. Lewis talks about the dialectic of desire. We have this desire. We tether it to the wrong object. It doesn't fulfill. We untether, tether it to something else. Doesn't fulfill. We untether, tether it to something else. Lewis says, if I find in myself a desire that nothing in this earth satisfies, doesn't mean the world is a fraud. It means maybe the world was to awaken the desire, but that the desire was ultimately for something transcendent. And I think we can work with that in people. So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but it is to me. I think our idolatry that we see with people, they think if I just get this job, I'll be fulfilled. If I just make this much money, I'll be fulfilled. If I can just meet this man or this woman, I'll be fulfilled. If I could just have this hobby or buy this sports car or something like that. It's all a quest to find the longing satisfied by tethering to the wrong object. It's a kind of idolatry. And we have to understand that those gods don't satisfy. Now, interestingly enough, does that mean you shouldn't have a desire for a spouse? Does that mean you shouldn't have a desire for a job that's meaningful? Or that you shouldn't have a desire for making a wage whereby you could live decently? No, but those should always be second. Lewis wrote an essay on it even called First and Second Things. If I put first things first, I get second things thrown in. If I put second things first, I lose out on first and second things. I want to find my primary desire fulfilled in God. Then I can appreciate these other things for what they can do and not expect from them what they cannot. If I begin to expect that my wife should do for me what only God can do for me, when she can't do that, I'll project my disappointment on her, and I'm the problem, not her. So we have to basically find our fulfillment ultimately in the first thing. So it gets back to, again, loving God is the most important thing.
I almost see that as kind of just that holy contentment that we're striving for things, but we're content. And I think Lewis does that so well with like the small things. Like I'm reminded like with when Shasta is running all night and he encounters the dwarves and they're having bacon and eggs and mushrooms and just like the smell of the food. And I'm like, I hate mushrooms, but I've never wanted to eat mushrooms so bad in my life. You know, it's just that idea of contentment, job well done. You're striving and life is worth enjoying and, you know, being content in that.
Yeah. Well, you got in the Hobbit too. They like mushrooms. Remember, they were stealing mushrooms from the farmer. So this flaw in you can be corrected, Heath. You could learn to love mushrooms one day.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe it's a sign. It's a sign all the time that I should be eating my mushrooms. But um, well, yeah, we didn't really talk about this in the questions, but I know you've also read a lot of Tolkien as well, and I have such a big love of his. And I think it was so interesting to see the kind of those sides of like Tolkien and Lewis, like they were friends, but they kind of struggled with things, or they would like back and forth on what story was. And I was just curious as we wrap up here, if you could kind of tell us like maybe some things that you've loved about Tolkien, or that you can see those kind of
Well,
connections.
I would say that they probably had more they shared in common when it came to stories than their differences. And Tolkien, by the way, when he didn't like the Narnian books because he felt they were a hodgepodge. That Lewis had brought in all these things. You've got uh, naiads and dryads. You've got minotaurs. You've got Nordic myth. You've got Greek myth. You've got all these different myths. You even throw Santa Claus in there, and you mix it all up, and Bacchus and so on. And he thought that Lewis made a hodgepodge of things, but it was Tolkien who said, "You've loved the myths whenever you've read them. Don't you see that the gods are coming down? There's something about these stories." So Lewis came to believe that the myths were to the pagan society what the Old Testament was to the Jews. They were tutors to lead them to Christ. So he has all these mythological creatures come just before Aslan comes. There was something that was deliberate about what he was doing. So Tolkien and Lewis had their disagreements, but by and large, their understanding of story was very, very similar. Tolkien's essay on stories, it was a lecture that he gave at St. Andrews University after The Hobbit was published, and it was on the nature of story. Many of the things that Tolkien writes about in that essay, Lewis writes about in individual essays, and you can find them in his book of Other Worlds or his book on stories. And they shared more in common than anything in difference. And remember, they read their stories to each other as they were writing them. They benefited much, and that group grew, the Inklings. The Inklings group, Diana Glyer, she's the best Inklings scholar out there. She wrote the book The Company They Keep, and she wrote a more popularized version called Bandersnatch. That group wrote 365 books among them. It's incredible. Lewis wrote the most, but they wrote 365 books. Well, anyway, the thing about Tolkien that I've seen lately that disappoints me is that people say that Lewis and Tolkien had a falling out at the end of their life. And that's just utterly false. There were some things that Lewis did that were unfortunate. He didn't tell Tolkien he got married. You'd think one of your best friends, you'd let him know. And there were some other things that Lewis did that were kind of goofy. But I've 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 had meals with two of Tolkien's kids. C.S. Lewis's son Douglas, whenever he had come to Chicago, he would stay with us. I knew him. We spoke at conferences together and so on. I feel really sad because he has serious dementia now, but bright guy and so on. Well, anyway, and he was a friend of Tolkien's, Douglas was, because Tolkien was part of their life. But John Tolkien, Tolkien's son, I met with him once for a beer and I met with him once for dinner. And I was asking him questions about these things. And I said, Humphrey Carpenter in his book, The Inkling, said your father and Lewis had a cooling of their relationship, kind of severed relationship at the end of their life. He says, I read that in Carpenter too, and I had no clue what he was talking about. Every week for the last year of Lewis's life, I would drive my father to the kilns so that he and Lewis could have 2 or 3 hours conversation together. That doesn't sound like somebody who had a falling out, but these people pick up a sentence from a letter, and again, inflate it all out of existence. But you find out the reality, and the reality is different than those who make these claims. And I've often found, even in Lewis studies, somebody says a falsehood, and rather than checking it out, somebody else repeats it. And then somebody else repeats that. And pretty soon, you've got this whole false narrative that's out there. And there's tons of stuff like that coming up about Lewis and Tolkien and so on. We just have to be careful. In this age of AI, I'm afraid more and more of it will come up because somebody will put in a computer, tell us what the relationship between Lewis and Tolkien is when it comes to story. And so AI gathers up from all the stuff that's out there and pulls in some of these false statements that are made. It's not correcting the errors. It's repeating them in a way that people think, oh, this must be the way it is, because after all, I got it from AI. So we're gonna have more troubles with this. We need careful scholarship, I think. We need people like Heath Fall doing podcasts that help us get clarity on these matters.
That's right. That's why we do it. Um, yeah, I think with AI specifically, you can see that danger of it's one more step removed, even from the source.
Yeah.
And the source could be wrong.
Yeah.
But it's like, well, I've gathered 5 sources. This is my statement.
Well,
It's like,
it's easy to check a lot of times. First off, I tell people, learn your informal fallacies, because you can always smell a rat if you see an informal fallacy. A false analogy, comparing apples and oranges, a sweeping generalization, a begging the question, assuming the outcome without proving the point. You've got ad misericordiam, you tell a sad story rather than really inferentially develop an argument. There's all these things. Do that, one. Number two, I think that a person could protect themselves from some of that if they just do basic research. For example, there was a myth going around for a long time that Lewis had a debate with Elizabeth Anscombe, February 2nd, 1948, and she destroyed his arguments for God's existence, and Lewis never forayed into the world of apologetics after that. He just drifted into story, and it's all nonsense. My doctoral supervisor was at the debate, and he not only said there were no fireworks, he said that they ran the debate again after Lewis died, and Anscombe came back to debate her part, and John Lucas, the Oxford philosopher, filtered Lewis's ideas through his. So obviously they're not pure, but they got a Lucasian feature to him. But nevertheless, he said, hands down, Lucas won the argument. They didn't even argue about God's existence. Anscombe was a Christian. Anscombe had a hand in helping the philosopher Wittgenstein come to faith before he died. It's amazing. But the thing about that debate is that somebody, even a guy like he wrote the biography of Lewis called Jack. I knew him. George Sayre. George Sayre said that he had breakfast with Lewis a few days later, and Lewis said, "She destroyed all my arguments for God's existence." You can read her essay. It was published with her papers. They didn't even argue about God's existence. They argued about whether or not a materialist could make an accurate argument, and an inferentially sound argument. And they weren't, Lewis was saying no, not to support materialism. And Anscombe was saying no, materialists, no matter what they believe about materialism, could begin with a definition about something and argue inferentially to it. They were arguing like this. So anyway, here's Lucas saying Lewis said she destroyed all my arguments about God's existence. I have a hard time believing that when I see they didn't even argue about God's existence. One. And number two, they said he wrote no more apologetics. You get that again in Humphrey Carpenter. You get it in Peter Scackle, who was a great Lewis scholar, but he should have known better than repeating these things. And you get it in A.N. Wilson's biography on C.S. Lewis. It's elegantly written. I wish I could write like Wilson, but it's got it's got mistake on every page in that book. So anyway, here was the thing. Take Lewis's writing after February 2nd, 1948, and you will see that he wrote 36 essays in apologetics before that date, and he wrote 34 essays in apologetics after that date. Doesn't look like a guy who gave up writing apologetics. You can just count. And not only that, several of the essays that he wrote after that debate were put together under common cover by Walter Hooper. Many of the essays in God in the Dark, some of the essays in Christian Reflections, many of the essays in Present Concerns, many of the essays in some of his other writings were written after the debate with Anscombe. So it's just false, utterly false, provably and excessively provably false. And so people just repeat the error without checking. And that's not good scholarship.
It reminds me, are you familiar with the what's it called? The Emerald Tablets of Thoth?
No,
Have you heard of these?
no.
It's really interesting. It's a false gospel. That's all it is. But it was this guy found these tablets that have a new gospel, but he never showed it to anybody. But he wrote a translation and it's out there. So provable that no one believes this guy, you know? But then people love to bring it up with like, well, actually, Jesus was married and he had a son. And like, it's one of those typical false gospels. And it's just, yeah, if you just look, if you do one more layer of research, it's provable, false. And yeah. Well, Jerry, thank you so much for being on. Is there a way that you'd like to point people to connect with you or to buy your books or just some resources?
Well, I never bring my books with me whenever I speak at something. They're out there. People can look them up if they're interested. But I'm not a marketer. I don't market
Yeah.
myself. I'm interested in Lewis. I'm interested in the world that he opens up to me. I'm interested in philosophy, theology. I'm interested in fantasy and literature and so on. And so I'm not marketing myself, but if people are interested in those things, they might find their interest encouraged in the things that we've written. And podcasts too. I was at my best friend's house recently and his kids were watching TV and I looked at the TV and I go, that looks like me on there. They said, it is you. I said, really? There's things out there of me? And I don't realize I'll be lecturing at something and somebody will video it and they put it up on YouTube and all this other stuff. So we counted 180 and we gave up counting. So there's stuff out there. If people are interested, they could find it and so on. And usually if they are interested, they will, but I don't market myself. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I can't encourage the person. If they're curious, they'll find it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll put a link to your website regardless. And yeah, you've written so many books about Lewis, and I think the Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis was the first book I wrote or I read from you
I did that
when you
with
read that
Mark
lecture.
Neal. I did that with Mark Neal, who's a brilliant writer. He's a
Yeah.
much better writer than I am. I have a pipes group that meets at my house. We've been meeting for over 20 years every Thursday night now when I'm in town because I travel so much. And I give them a thumbs width of single malt, no more than that. People say a thumbs width? You mean a thumbs width? No, I go, no, a thumbs width. And that should last you 3 hours if you drink it well, and you should never have a buzz, ever. Never drink for a buzz and all that stuff. Thumbs width of single malt. We light up our pipes, we have a discussion, and we keep the discussion in the middle. No sidebars. We talk about a particular topic. The topic may develop and emerge throughout the evening. And Mark had written some journal articles about C.S. Lewis. He hadn't written a book. And I had discovered that there were 31 different ways Lewis used the word imagination. You know, they say the Eskimos have 30 words for snow because they live in it 24/7 and they can, nuance the snow better than us. Powder snow, dry snow, wet snow, sticky snow, oily, whatever. So I've since discovered about two more since we wrote the book. But I go to the pipes group that night and I say, Mark, you haven't done a book yet. And here's a book I want to do on Lewis and the imagination, and you're the guy that needs to do it with me. Let's do this. So then Mark said, okay, let's do it. I think it came out well. I think it's a good book. But then after that book was over, Mark said we should do another book together. And I said, okay. There are all kinds of books Lewis wrote. His best books are his literary critical books. Nobody reads them. Anybody who's a pastor, who's preaching the word, should read his books on literary criticism, where he talks about how to analyze a text, just like the sentence we started out with in this podcast. We fulfilled our whole duty to you if we can help you see some given tract of reality. He's talking to students where he wants them to see what the text says. When you read Milton, when you read Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida and so on. Lewis's literary critical works help you impede false notions about a text and how to interpret a text and encourage right notions about how to do it. So we decided we were going to write a book called The Neglected C.S. Lewis. And we would look at 8 of these books that nobody reads and introduce them to them. It was an exercise in futility, of course, because if people are neglecting those books, they're going to neglect the book about those books. So anyway, but it was still a good exercise. And I hope that maybe some people, when they read that book, will say, wow, I really do need to read The Allegory of Love, or I really do need to read An Experiment in Criticism, or I really do need to read English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama. So anyway, Lewis did that too, right? He wrote Preface to Paradise Lost. He's trying to introduce Paradise Lost to people so they'll read it. I'm sure if you said to Lewis, what should I read, your book on Paradise Lost or Paradise Lost? He'd say, read Paradise Lost. If you said, should I read your Allegory of Love or should I read Troilus and Cressida by Chaucer? He'd say, you should read Troilus and Cressida. Should I read the Allegory of Love or should I read Spencer's, Edmund Spencer's Faerie Queene? He'd say, read the Faerie Queene. I'm probably the only former PE major in the world who's actually read the Faerie Queene and loved it, but I wouldn't have gotten to it had it not been for Lewis shining the light down the right path. So anyway,
That's no, that's amazing. I love that. Well, Jerry, just thank you so much for being on. I'm a big, I love hearing your lecture. Your books have meant a lot to me, so I really appreciate you taking the time to do this podcast with us today. So you're a busy guy, and I know you just got back from London. Is that right?
I was in Oxford last week, yeah. And then I was home for a week, but the week before that I was in Czech Republic. I've got 10 trips overseas this year, and I love it. And I've got several trips to the West Coast as well, and other traveling as well. But I like it. I'm old, and I want to keep doing it as long as I can. I'm retired, so I have flexibility of time. But I love it. If I can ever serve you again too, Heath, let me know. I'd be happy to do it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I'd love to have you on again. Well, the knowledge, the being able to ask you questions has just been really, really great. So thank you so
You can
much.
say on your podcast too, if there's other people who would like me to serve them, I'm happy to do it. I believe
Yeah.
God calls us to service, and ultimately, I don't want people to accept C.S. Lewis into their heart. I want them to accept Jesus. And if Lewis is a means to that, that's great. As soon as he becomes a distraction to Christ, I'm not interested, frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, sir.
Blessings. Go love your wife and love your kids.